beneath the black pines. The sleepy town of Hemlock Hollow was nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, surrounded by thick forests and towering black pines that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. The locals lived quiet lives, many generations old, and the traditions and superstitions of the town had long been passed down like gospel. The most famous, and perhaps the most feared, was the tale of the Hollow Man. It was said that the Hollow Man lived in the dense woods beyond town, a specter or creature that haunted the depths of black pine forest. He was a being with no face, no eyes, and no voice, yet he wandered those woods, waiting for the foolish to stray too far. Over the years, stories surfaced about disappearances, about people vanishing into the forest, never to be seen again. Some swore they had seen him, tall, gaunt, a figure that seemed to blend into the very shadows of the trees, only to emerge when it was too late. As children, Dean and his sister Emily had been terrified of these stories, huddling together under blankets as their grandmother spun her yarns by the fireplace. Dean, though younger by a year, was always the braver of the two. He'd reassure Emily it was all nonsense, just tales to scare children. After all, no one really believed in the supernatural, right? But as they grew older, Emily's fear lingered, while Dean's curiosity blossomed into a reckless fascination. It wasn't long after their grandmother passed away that Dean began to wonder what lay beneath those tall, dark trees. It wasn't that he believed in the stories of the Hollow Man, but there was something about the woods, something about the vastness and silence of it, that called to him. One autumn afternoon, the wind howling softly through the trees, Dean made up his mind. He would go into the forest. Not far, just enough to explore a bit beyond the edges where the other townsfolk dared not tread. He packed a backpack with essentials, a flashlight, a few snacks, and his phone, which he figured might come in handy if he lost his way. Emily, of course, thought it was a terrible idea. "Don't be stupid, Dean," she warned as she stood in the doorway, watching him lace up his boots. "You know the stories. People have gone missing out there." Dean smiled in that cocky way that always made Emily feel like he was invincible. They're just stories. I'm not going far, just a quick hike. I'll be back before dark." She crossed her arms, her eyes wide with worry. "Please don't do this." But Dean was already halfway out the door. He turned, giving her a wink. "I'll be fine. I'll text you when I'm back. Maybe I'll even catch a glimpse of the Hollow Man, huh?" Emily didn't laugh. She just watched him disappear down the dirt road toward the forest, her stomach knotting with dread. The woods were dense, thicker than Dean had expected. The towering black pines loomed overhead, their gnarled branches casting long, dark shadows that moved with the wind. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became. Even the birds seemed to avoid this part of the forest. There was only the sound of his own footsteps crunching over dead leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, and the soft whistle of the wind through the trees. At first, Dean felt exhilarated. The air was crisp, and the thrill of exploring the forbidden woods sent a surge of adrenaline through him. He kept his flashlight off, the dim afternoon light filtering through the canopy enough to see by. The path he had followed for the first mile had slowly faded away into the underbrush, but Dean pressed on, determined to go just a bit further before turning back. That's when he saw it. About 20 feet ahead, a figure stood between the trees, barely visible through the thickening mist. It was tall, unnaturally so, its head almost brushing the lower branches of the pines. Dean's breath caught in his throat. The figure was motionless, like a statue carved from shadow, its long, gaunt body blending seamlessly with the darkness of the forest. He blinked, and the figure was gone. Dean shook his head, his heart pounding in his chest. It had to be a trick of the light, the mist playing with his vision. He continued forward, but now his pace had slowed, and he found himself glancing over his shoulder more often than before. The deeper he went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees, once evenly spaced and upright, now grew twisted and close together, their bark blackened as if scorched by fire. The air grew colder, and the mist thickened into a dense fog that clung to the ground like a living thing. Dean could barely see more than a few feet in front of him now, and the sense of isolation weighed heavily on him. Then he heard it, a faint rustling, like footsteps on leaves, but not his own. Dean froze, his hand tightening around the flashlight in his pocket. He turned slowly, his breath shallow, scanning the fog for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the trees, standing tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. Dean exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. He was just about to turn back when he saw it again, the figure, standing a little closer this time. It had no face. Where eyes and a mouth should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless void, as if someone had erased its features with a single stroke. Its body was impossibly thin, its limbs long and spindly, hanging limply at its sides. Dean's blood turned to ice. His heart pounded in his chest as the figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Without thinking, he turned and ran. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to get away. The trees seemed to close in around him, the mist thickening into a suffocating blanket that made it hard to see, hard to breathe. His lungs burned as he sprinted through the underbrush, branches tearing at his clothes and skin. He could hear it behind him now, the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, the sound of something moving swiftly through the fog, following him. Dean's foot caught on a root, and he stumbled, crashing to the ground. Pain shot through his ankle, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. He scrambled to his feet, glancing behind him, expecting to see the faceless figure closing in. But it wasn't there. The forest was still, silent, as if nothing had ever been chasing him at all. Dean's breath came in ragged gasps as he limped forward, desperate to find his way back to the edge of the forest. His ankle throbbed with every step, but the fear pushing him forward was stronger than the pain. As the minutes dragged on, the trees around him began to blur together, and Dean realized, with a sickening sense of dread, that he was lost. He had no idea where he was or how far he had come. The fog made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, and the fading daylight only made things worse. He pulled out his phone, hoping to use the GPS to find his way back, but there was no signal. The screen flickered, then went dark, the battery dead. Panic set in. He was alone, lost in a cursed forest, with no way to call for help. And something not human, was out there, watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. The wind picked up, a low, mournful howl that echoed through the trees. Dean shivered, his breath visible in the cold air. He had to keep moving, had to find a way out. But no matter which direction he turned, the forest seemed to stretch on forever, an endless maze of black pines and fog. Hours passed, though it felt like days. Dean's legs were heavy, his ankle swollen and painful, and exhaustion weighed on him like a lead blanket. He hadn't seen the faceless figure again, but the feeling of being watched never left him. It was always there, just out of sight, lurking in the shadows, waiting for him to falter. Just when he thought he couldn't go any further, Dean stumbled into a small clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated cabin, its roof caved in and its windows broken. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, maybe even longer, but it was shelter. And right now, that was all that mattered. Dean limped toward the cabin, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and fear. The door was hanging off its hinges, creaking as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, shattered glass, old newspapers that crumbled at the touch. He collapsed onto the floor, leaning against the wall as he tried to catch his breath. His body ached, and the pain in his ankle was nearly unbearable. But for the moment, he was safe. At least, that's what he told himself. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the trees like a living thing. The walls of the cabin creaked and groaned, but they held firm. Dean pulled his jacket tighter around him, trying to stay warm as the temperature continued to drop. As he sat there, his back against the wall, Dean's mind began to wander. He thought about Emily, about how worried she must be. He thought about his grandmother's stories, about the legend of the Hollow Man. He had never believed in it, not really. But now, a sound interrupted his thoughts, a soft, almost imperceptible scratching, coming from somewhere inside the cabin. Dean froze, his blood running cold. The sound was faint, but it was there, just at the edge of hearing, like something scraping against wood. He held his breath, straining to listen. Scratch. 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 It was coming from beneath the floorboards. Dean's heart pounded in his chest as he scrambled to his feet, ignoring the pain in his ankle. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was beneath the floor was trying to claw its way up. He backed away from the center of the room, his eyes scanning the floor for any sign of movement. The floorboards trembled, dust rising as something pressed against them from below. Dean's breath came in short gasps as he stumbled toward the door. But before he could reach it, the floorboards burst open with a deafening crack. A hand, pale, skeletal, emerged from the darkness beneath the cabin, grasping at the air. Dean's scream caught in his throat as he stumbled backward, his eyes wide with terror. The hand was followed by another, and then a head, smooth and featureless, like the figure he had seen in the woods. The Hollow Man. Dean's mind raced, every instinct screaming at him to run, but his body was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The creature pulled itself up through the hole in the floor, its tall, gaunt body unfolding like a spider emerging from its web. It stood before him now, towering over him, its faceless head tilting to one side as if studying him. Dean could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, pounding like a drum. The Hollow Man took a step forward, its long, bony fingers reaching for him. Dean stumbled back, his legs giving way beneath him as he hit the ground hard. Pain shot through his ankle, but he didn't care. All that mattered was getting away. But there was nowhere to go. The Hollow Man's hand brushed against his face, cold as death. Dean's vision blurred, the world around him fading into darkness. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. Then, everything went black. Days passed before they found him. The search party had combed the forest for miles, but it wasn't until a hunter stumbled across the old cabin that they found Dean. He was lying in the center of the room, his body cold and still, his face twisted in a final expression of terror. There was no sign of what had killed him. No wounds, no blood. Just the look of pure fear etched into his features. The people of Hemlock Hollow whispered about the Hollow Man, about how Dean had gone too far into the woods and paid the ultimate price. Emily stood at the edge of the forest, tears streaming down her face as the men carried her brother's body back to town. She had warned him. She had begged him not to go. But now, standing there in the fading light, Emily knew the truth. The Hollow Man was real. And he was still out there, waiting.